I'm Euro.
I'm Chris.
And this is Fork Bomb. March 13th, 2017. And today we're going to be talking about, I don't know. We can't decide what to call this episode. So today's episode is called Nothing. We have stuff to talk about, but we don't know what to call it because we have conflicting conflicting information.
I don't know about conflicting. I mean, maybe it's just so much fun information that we don't want to limit the amount of fun that we have with it.
Okay. Conflicting fun information. All right, so this is what we originally wanted to call it. What if Intel never existed? Everybody knows Intel and everything. But the problem with that is that there was another company before Intel called Fairchild. And if we talk about Intel not existing, well, then did Fairchild exist? Because a lot of the inventions from Fairchild went straight to Intel. I think that eventually everything that Intel made later, Fairchild would have made because they had the same engineers. Mostly. The key ones. Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce. So then we'd have to say, okay, well, then the topic should be called, what if Fairchild never existed? That's great, except not a lot of people know Fairchild. But everybody knows Intel. So we didn't really want to call it that. And then we thought, okay, well, what if Fairchild existed, but Bob Noyce, who was the founder of Fairchild, what if he didn't exist? Well, then Fairchild wouldn't exist. So what if Bob Noyce existed, but then he went bankrupt? Then Fairchild wouldn't have existed, and then the topic wouldn't have been called "What if Intel never existed?" So you see, it's this big deal, and we can't really figure out what to call it.
And really, when we started off with "What if Intel never existed?" Well, Intel was pretty much the same crew as Fairchild, with a few exceptions. But the reality of the situation is the entire computing industry is standing on the shoulders of 4, 5, 6 well-known giants who had key ideas at the right times. And without them, without those extremely talented, extremely motivated people, Intel would never have existed, Fairchild, or our digital lifestyles as we know it. So that's why I was thinking it's really hard to say, well, why just Intel? We can say what if Intel never existed, but what if Bob Noyce got hit by a bus? Or like you were saying off recording, what if he did live but decided to go and become a doctor and play golf for the rest of his life?
Right, and then Gordon Moore all of a sudden didn't want to start Intel. He's perfectly happy at Fairchild, but then would Fairchild have still developed everything? I don't know. So I think that at this point we need to explain to people who Bob Noyce was, and another really another really talented engineer. His name is Federico Fagin. We also need to talk about him, and maybe Ted Hoff and these other brilliant engineers whom we owe a lot to, and we hardly hear about them.
Agreed. Would you like to start, or would you like me to start?
No, go ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Okay, so I guess we'll start in with the history of Intel. So the two main people behind Intel are Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore of Moore's Law. And they founded Intel in 1968 when they left Fairchild Semiconductor. However, Fairchild is where we first got the concept of integrated circuits, or the ability to enable all the components of a circuit to be imprinted and connected in a single silicon chip. while they did not invent this idea, originally, at least the first person to have thought of it and written it down was Jack Kilby of Texas Instruments. Robert Noyce was the first one who had the idea of creating integrated circuits out of silicon instead of germanium. The problem with germanium is that it was too expensive and too time-consuming to create, and so without the idea of creating it out of silicon, integrated circuits may never have made it to market. So we may not even have had integrated circuits, which were an improvement on discrete sets of circuitry designed to do a specific thing.
Either that or integrated circuits would have been more expensive, and the amount of integrated circuits that we use now, it would have been prohibitively expensive to build computers out of, to build smartphones, things like that. Everything uses integrated circuits nowadays. Everything has processors, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But to make them out of different materials and not silicone would have made your phones and laptops and computers much more expensive. The thing about it is, I know that over time and as manufacturing process gets more refined, it tends to get cheaper to manufacture. But still, making it out of silicone is it really made it cheap from the get-go, and that was important because then the manufacturing process it caught up, but it was already pretty cheap to manufacture. So that was important, and that was one of the things that Bob Noyce did that really earned everybody's respect. We really do owe a lot to him, and the engineers that were working with him. So I read that Bob Noyce actually in the beginning, since manufacturing hadn't caught up and everything, they had made they were selling integrated circuits for a higher cost than it was to produce it, which was driving the engineers crazy and the people at the manufacturing, and I bet you all the finance people were going crazy too. But his thought was that demand would eventually catch up.
I think you mean the other way around. He was selling it at a lower cost than it was to produce it.
Oh, did I say that all backwards?
It's okay.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Selling it at a loss.
Selling it at a loss. Yes. I don't know why I said that all weird. Yeah. So that was some insight there that Noyce had to be able to accurately predict that integrated circuits were going to take off. The demand was going to be there. So he would he almost bet on it and he won.
And since integrated circuits, since they were so far ahead of its time in just what they were and what you could do with them, use cases had to be invented for them. In fact, Fairchild released a promotional video
I saw that.
talking all about how integrated circuits were made and what you can do with them and who was already using them. And honestly, I found it fascinating. I'm definitely putting that one in the show notes. It's two engineers awkwardly reading off really technical stuff, trying to talk about how great integrated circuits are and how they're made, and it's really neat to see the birth of something that we take so much for granted, because we have them in everything. And we're talking like not even processors yet, just basic integrated circuits. And even if we didn't have the microprocessor today, we would still have integrated circuits everywhere in everything.
Integrated circuits and you.
Yes.
So with integrated circuits, It's funny, we've been talking about all this stuff, but yet we haven't even reached Intel. So Bob Noyce, after inventing coming up with the integrated circuits, the manufacturing portion and doing well in that, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore decided to leave Fairchild to start another company. So I suppose that from what I gathered, it was that Bob Noyce and a few other engineers were their company that they had started became very, I almost want to say, corporate, and a lot of the politicalness was going on and everything, and that's exactly what they didn't like, and what they all came from. Bob Noyce came from another semiconductor company called Shockley Semiconductors, and so he left that to form Fairchild, and now he left Fairchild to form another company because he didn't really like that whole when big companies become too political, and he wanted to keep it more like I almost want to say a startup, but to say Intel and startup in the same sentence is
a meritocracy.
Weird, yes,
he wanted it to be a meritocracy where everyone is equal, and it's all based on your drive and your ability.
Right, and your merits.
Do you remember what the name of the nickname that Bob Noyce's crew, the 8 of them, had when they left Shockley?
When they left Shockley, they did have a nickname, didn't they?
The Traitorous 8.
Oh yeah.
Yep. I think that's just a really good gang name.
Yeah, that's great. So, oh man, I would love to go back in time and somehow bump into all those guys and be a part of that, because they were definitely a part of history.
And if for anyone who's never seen a video of Bob Noyce speaking, he's a really charismatic guy. He has this really persuasive, deep voice, extremely articulate. He is this odd mix of engineer, self-sufficient entrepreneur, charismatic powerhouse that can convince you of everything. He's like, I don't know. He's a true Renaissance man, I would say.
If you thought that Steve Jobs was charismatic, Steve Jobs was listening to Bob Noyce.
In fact, Steve Jobs was friends with Bob Noyce.
That's right. Steve Jobs would go to Bob Noyce's house.
Yeah, have dinner.
And
go on vacations.
And have dinner. And Steve Jobs would listen to Bob Noyce. Bob Noyce was driving everything. And this is Steve Jobs. I mean, he's the one that takes control and then just runs with it. And it was Bob Noyce that was doing that. So, yeah, definitely.
He was definitely a mentor to Steve Jobs. So, I mean, without Bob Noyce, maybe Steve Jobs wouldn't have gotten the inspiration that he had to go as far as he did.
That's right. We may not have an Apple if it wasn't for Bob Noyce. Maybe Steve Jobs wouldn't have been inspired. So back to Intel. So Noyce and Moore left Fairchild to create another semiconductor company called Integrated Electronics. And actually, they first called it N&M Semiconductors or N&M Electronics. I forget which one, but they liked Integrated Electronics better, and then they shortened it to Intel.
Actually, wasn't it? It was originally a combination of Moore's and now how did it come out? It came out to be like Mo Noyce or More. It was More Noyce, and that sounded too much like more noise.
Oh, which wasn't a good thing.
Definitely not what you want in your electronics, and so they renamed it to Intel.
Right, because of
Integrated
interference.
Electronics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because of interference, electrical interference, they would call that noise, and so they quickly scratched that idea. Neat, but wouldn't have worked out.
No, not so much. It's kind of like the Chevy Nova in Spanish-speaking countries.
Doesn't go. Right. So now, so at Intel, a bright engineer, his name was Ted Hoff, he came up with the idea of a programmable integrated circuit, the microprocessor.
And a little bit of background there. Sorry to cut you off. Please hold that thought.
Go ahead.
And the reason that he came up with this idea was they were working with a Japanese calculator manufacturing company, and Ted Hoff was looking at, well, I mean, we're going to need an integrated circuit for this, and an integrated circuit for that, and an integrated circuit for that. And this was his solution to that.
They thought about putting all the pieces together into one single chip. So that became the microprocessor.
One reprogrammable single chip.
Yeah, that's key because that allowed that single chip to be used in multiple applications. So calculator is only the beginning. The engineer that designed the first commercial microprocessor was Federico Fagin, which I believe he's an Italian immigrant. And he actually used to work at a big company called Olivetti, which I know because I dealt with some of their products back in the day.
Would it be, if he's Italian, would it be Fagin?
Ooh, I don't know.
I mean, they are like Spanish vowels. Just guessing.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, Italian, right?
Yeah.
They wouldn't say Fagin.
No, they have formal values there. They have formal vowels there. They're not barbarians like we Americans are.
All right, I like that. Federico Fagin. Okay, well, so thinking about it this way, actually, if he hadn't worked at Intel, we probably wouldn't have the design of the microprocessor. I mean, it was still, the idea came up by Ted Hoff, but Federico actually designed it. So, would somebody else have taken his place? Perhaps, but he was the one that did it. So, if he didn't work at Intel, maybe it would have taken longer to have the first commercial microprocessor.
So, to backtrack a little bit about something that was skipped over regarding Fairchild. Fairchild was founded October 1st, 1957. 3 days later, on October 4th, 1957, Sputnik was launched, and the space race began. And our government started pouring tons of money into electronics. So the timing there could not have been better. So we can't help but wonder, if it wasn't Fairchild, who would it have been that suddenly would have started getting tons of funding from our government, and what inventions would they have come up with? Would they have come up with similar inventions like the integrated circuit? Would it have been, where was it? Where would it have been Texas Instruments, who would have been coming out with their germanium-based integrated circuits and then saying, you know what, this sucks. Let's just go with silicon. That seems so much easier.
Or even Shockley.
And Shockley was one of the inventors of the transistor.
That's right. Yes, something as huge as that. They may have come up with they may have come up with ICs later on. I think that it would have been later, though. I don't think that I think that without Bob Noyce and team, I don't think the integrated circuit would have been a commercial success at the time that it was. So we may have seen integrated circuits come out in the late 60s, 70s, perhaps 80s, and so that would have kind of slowed the whole process of the computer evolution or the computer revolution. We may have been stuck with older base transistors. I don't want to say vacuum tubes, but definitely we wouldn't have gone through that computer revolution we did in the 70s and 80s if it hadn't been for Intel.
And that possibly could have slowed us down in the space race. For all we know, that could have been the difference of who made it to the moon first.
Could have been. Although the Soviets were were using their own equipment, but hey, maybe they were also using some of Fairchild's ICs. They could have had people here bring chips over there. I don't know. So back to Mr. Fagin. So if he hadn't worked at Intel, the microprocessor could have been delayed. I don't think it would have been stopped. I mean, Ted Hoff had come up with it, but without Federico's design expertise, I think that the first chip, the 4004, would have been released later, and perhaps the Altair, which used a later version of the microprocessor, a later version. I want to say the 8088. No, the 8008. They may have gone off to use a different processor too. Another noteworthy thing about Federico is that he created a company. He actually left Intel to create a company called Zilog. And the thing about Zilog is that it was a vastly superior version of the Intel chip that they came up with, a microprocessor. And not a lot of people know, but the chip in the original Game Boy, which was actually a Zilog chip, which was the Z80. And the Z80 was a very popular chip to put onto microcomputers back in the 80s. So yeah, I mean, if he hadn't worked for Intel, perhaps he wouldn't have started Zilog, and then we would be using either some other chip, or maybe Intel would have powered the Game Boy. But if Intel had never been, right, no Intel.
So either way we slice it, this all leads up to a world without a Game Boy.
World without a Game Boy. But you know what? I haven't mentioned one important thing, and it's that despite all of this, Intel coming up with the first microprocessor, the 4004, which, by the way, was Mr. Federico came up with something called the silicon gate technology. He implemented that with the microprocessor. That and some other of his designs allowed that microprocessor to work 5 times faster and with fewer transistors. So definitely we have a lot to thank him for as well. But despite all of this, guess who we still would have had, though?
Who's that?
We still would have had AMD. So it would be Fairchild and AMD instead of Intel and AMD competing.
So how would we still have had AMD? I'm not familiar with their story.
Well, because the engineers from... So there was a lot of people leaving Fairchild at the time that Bob Noyce left. Some went to Intel, but some other ones decided, well, they wanted to come up with their own company too. And so they did, and that was Advanced Micro Devices.
Ah.
Yep. Yeah, so we still would have had AMD, and that rivalry would... depends on how Fairchild played it. That may have... we may run Fairchild chips versus AMD's, whatever, Ryzen or something.
The funny thing with these people and these personalities is we've all heard the saying in our job, no one is indispensable. Do your job or somebody else will. But in the case of Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore and Shockley and Federico Fagin, I think some of them we could say they were indispensable. They were at such a high specialized level when it comes to this stuff that without them, at least one of them, we could say without them we would still be set back today.
Yeah, I think so. They definitely, their contributions allowed us to be where we are today. Absolutely. What I haven't really gone over is it's the reason why microprocessors are so significant to the computer revolution, and it was that later on, Intel came out with the 8080 microprocessor. This was after the Altair and everything. and after the Apple II, the 8080 microprocessor was used in the personal computer that IBM made. So that was huge. First of all, that brought Intel lots of money, and Intel was focusing on RAM back then. Computer memory was their focus. Integrated circuits, of course, and they were using that towards computer memory. That was their core of their business until the microprocessor took off, until IBM signed that deal with Intel, and then all IBM PCs were running the Intel microprocessor, and other companies like AMD were cloning the microprocessor by Intel to put in their own computers. So that's how important Intel's history goes. Would if Intel hadn't existed, would the computer revolution have taken off? Would IBM have used a different chip? Would IBM have designed their own chip? Motorola, they could have designed the microprocessor instead, but without Bob Noyce's expertise and everything, no Federico Fagin there. So I don't know. It's so many questions here.
Definitely. Yeah, it's really hard to say with this one. One thing that is easy to say though is what things would be like without the microprocessor, because of how many things they are currently in.
Well, I mean, Intel was putting microprocessors in everything. They called it embedded control devices. Things like elevators have microprocessors, gas pumps, toasters. Everything has some version of a microprocessor.
Everything, like literally everything. Our cars.
Right.
Just looking out of the room, I can name, 2 things right now that doesn't have maybe 3, a microprocessor in it. These blinds, my bed sheets, and a door.
I have a lamp here. That might have a microprocessor in there. Yes, everything nowadays does. It makes me wonder how people lived back in the 40s and 50s without them. I know things were much more manual back then. So we have the microprocessor and Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, Mr. Federico to thank for, amongst other engineers, of course.
There is one other thing though, that is noteworthy, and today we live in a society where we consider things to be disposable. They break, we just throw them out and replace them. And there was a time when that wasn't always the case. And actually, there's a little bit of irony coming up here. So Bob Noyce, he grew up in Iowa. It was a tiny in a tiny town where church was the center of community, and they had a very congregational type of lifestyle. And when things broke, they didn't throw them out. They just fixed them, because that was what they had to do. It wasn't as easy as just, order it on Amazon or eBay or whatever, or just go down to the nearest store. They couldn't. But when the integrated circuit started, Bob Noyce had the vision of creating things that he basically created the notion of planned obsolescence and disposable devices, and is
Right.
even on record of saying, I'm paraphrasing, but we're going to make devices that can't be fixed, they'll just be thrown out. That's a terrible paraphrasing of it, but the irony is someone who was so self-sufficient and was so used to, well, if this thing is broken, I just have to fix it or reuse it in some other way, would spearheaded the revolution of, well, it's broken, throw it out. And
who's gonna go and fix an IC?
Yeah, and most
who's
of the time,
gonna fix an integrated circuit?
Most of the time, you can't.
Right.
You just can't.
Yeah, you'd have to either replace the board, or most of the time you can't. You're right. That is interesting. I didn't really think about that. it was. I mean, good for them. They came out with a product that people had to replace. They couldn't repair it.
Yeah,
Nobody could.
but then maybe if Intel never existed, if Fairchild, if Bob Noyce was hit by a bus, we would still be able to fix our stuff.
But it wouldn't be as cool.
No, it wouldn't.
Other things that would be affected if we didn't have the microprocessor, if Intel hadn't existed, and for some reason no other company came up with a microprocessor, would be work. So I work with computers. I wouldn't be able to do my job without them. So that's important. And other fields, lots and lots of fields would be affected by this. Global connectivity uses the things like the phone company, the cell phones, everything uses microprocessors. Business, the way we conduct business today with the internet, nope, none of that would be possible.
The advances in medical equipment.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. The advances in medical equipment.
Right. Medicine, home appliances, TV, transportation, everything would be affected. Now, I don't want to say that without Intel, none of these things would be the same as we have today. Perhaps another company would have stepped forward. Maybe even IBM would have come up later with the microprocessor, with the idea of the microprocessor. But remember, IBM wanted to make big industrial things. They weren't out there for little small things like phones and stuff. So they may have invented more enterprise level things, but and I'm talking about the microprocessor, and then maybe another company like AMD may have cloned it or done something with that, and then we would all be using AMD devices. But I think that Intel definitely we have a lot to thank for that. Intel's contribution, they brought a lot of bright engineers all in one place. They started, it's interesting, they started their company with computer memory. And actually, I've seen some flash drives and things like that made by Intel. I actually have one. I have it's one of the, what is it, like I've seen Intel memory and things like that. I have an SSD, so Intel SSD. But it's just it's interesting. They started out their company with computer memory, moved over to the microprocessor, and now they're making memory and things like that again. So
and they also set they also laid the framework for how startups in Silicon Valley operate. That spirit, that culture, that was Bob Noyce.
I wonder if we would have a Silicon Valley without Intel, without Bob Noyce.
If we did, it wouldn't be the same. Like, he was just wanting to get away from the East Coast way, the East Coast hierarchical. I cannot say that word. The hierarchy style way of doing business. He wanted to get away from that.
Yeah, and the relaxed culture of Silicon Valley definitely reflects Bob Noyce's idea of getting away from how business was conducted in the East Coast. So I know Fairchild started in the West Coast. So I guess we would have it if Fairchild was a thing, and that's why we can't come up with the title of this show, because we don't know if it's a Fairchild thing or an Intel thing or what. But I know if Bob Noyce hadn't existed, perhaps Silicon Valley wouldn't be what it is today. Maybe it would just be a normal city, and Silicon Valley would be elsewhere in the East Coast. Things like so Noyce after Noyce actually had to do two jobs at once in the late 80s, right before his death. He actually started a consortium of sharing technologies with other competitors, because the foreign markets in ICs and computer memory was very strong. the Japanese were bringing in computer memory that was very cheap. So they were fiercely competing against American companies, against Intel, and so Intel had to shift. They had to pivot over to the microprocessor, so Noyce thought that that in order to compete, not only is the microprocessor something that they wanted to move forward with, but they also should share technology with other giants. And so he started a consortium to share technology called Semitech. And so that was another noteworthy thing that Bob Noyce did. And just thought that Bob Noyce worked almost all the way to his death. After he had left Semitech, that was only a few years later. He pretty much died right after that. So we could say that he worked most of his life, and I think that running Intel and running Semitech really took a toll on his life.
Maybe, and it's kind of sad because he always stayed very healthy too. He was really into swimming, was always a swimmer, and died of a heart attack right after getting out of the pool.
Yeah.
In 1990, I believe it was.
A sad day. So I wrote a very, very small list of things that we that we would still have without Intel. Now, this doesn't mean that other companies wouldn't have created ICs, and by Intel I mean Fairchild as well. But that doesn't mean another company wouldn't have created it. It may have taken longer, or be just more expensive, so we wouldn't use it the same way as we do today. But in this small list, if Fairchild stayed but Intel did not, then we would definitely have integrated circuits. We have mass productions of ICs by using silicon wafers. We've had the planar process. AMD would have come out, and we would still have computer memory. So those are all things that my small list that we would still have without Intel. But I think that we would be at a loss if they hadn't if Intel hadn't been made, if Fairchild hadn't been made, if Bob Noyce was ran over by a bus before he left Shockley, or even during Fairchild's time, So
I think if that were the case, someone still would have come up with the microprocessor, because Ted Hoff was still around, Mr. Fagin was still around, so someone else would have done it there. I think if we had Fairchild from beginning to end, but then no Intel, we would still have the world that we have today, just slightly different.
I don't really have anything else to say. We can go into that whole Microsoft Intel thing, the Wintel chips and everything, but that's later.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to say either.
Intel is pretty huge, just like Microsoft is. But I think we covered the basics. Yeah.
Definitely. I think it was very good coverage.
Yeah.
Okay, well then we should wrap it up.
We should wrap it up.
That concludes our, we're not sure what to title it, look at Intel and Robert Noyce and crew and Fairchild and integrated circuits and microprocessors and what ifs from every angle we can think of. That was fun, Euro.
Yeah, I really like these topics. They're very open-ended. We have a lot to thank for. These are, these companies are pioneers, and I never really saw them like that. Like our Microsoft episode, it was almost like I was angry. And Intel, I always want AMD to do better, just because they're the underdog, and I like the underdog, but when I look at the history behind Intel, I understand, I have a new found respect and admiration now for these companies.
Bob Noyce especially. I mean, I don't know, just learning about him, looking at what he did, the drive that he had. I feel so inadequate with what I'm doing with my life now compared to him. I think anyone who learns about him couldn't help but feel that way.
Agreed. He's such an inspiration, even after his death. I feel like I should be doing something else. Yeah. Okay, well, that about wraps it up for this episode.
Yes, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you again, Euro, as always, for the wonderful conversation.
Thanks, Chris. Bye-bye. Oh, man, you're going to have to edit this out. I swallowed wrong.
What did you swallow?
I was trying to hold it in.
Are you okay?
Yeah. I need to get water, though. Let me take a quick break and get some water.
All right.
All right, hang on.